Hello and welcome to November's All the Everything. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And this is a different All the Everything to how we usually do things. I'm really excited about this. I just had this desire not to do a whole show of me just kind of, I mean, I will be, I guess, I still a whole show of me talking actually, but I just felt like I wanted to be more in the response to something rather than me just speaking to a topic. And so this month, the invitation was to our listeners, to our group members, to ask me whatever they want, and then I would answer the question on the show. So that's what I'll be doing. And the questions are incredible, really sort of foundational, deep questions, and each definitely could be a show in their own right and may well become a show in their own right, but I'll do what I can to answer as fully as possible in this episode. So I'm going to start, as I usually do, but I don't think I have in the last month or two, with what I've been creating, consuming over the last month. And the first one I'm going to talk about is what I've been consuming, which is a book called Alchemy by, I think the author's name's Rory Sutherland. I think that's it. And I think he's the chairman of the Ogilvy Group. And it was a funny book for me to read. I've got no idea how it ended up on my Kindle. Long story short, whilst I was on holiday last week, my Wi-Fi wouldn't connect to the hotel's, sorry, my Kindle wouldn't connect to the hotel's Wi-Fi. And so then out of desperation, because I'd read the two hard copy books I'd brought with me, and out of desperation, I was just searching through my Kindle of like, what have I got on my Kindle already that I can read, and found this book called Alchemy that I downloaded the book at some point. I don't know when, I don't know why, I don't know who recommended it to me, but I was like, oh, okay, maybe I was meant to read this. And it was fabulous, absolutely fabulous. So the title sounds like a typical book I would read. Most of the books I read in some way or other to do with magic or spirituality, but it's actually more of a, I guess the closest thing you could say is a book on business or marketing stroke creativity. It's in that kind of realm. Ogilvy obviously being an advertising agency, and so it's kind of coming very much from the lens of what the author, I mean, he seems like a very magical creature, like just an amazing man, so much like just openness and playfulness, but it's all of the different things that he's learned through all these years in advertising, which is very much really in many ways the kind of study of humans, how humans tick, why they do what we do. And it has been one of those books that I probably thought about or quoted, probably many times a day since I read it. It really was one of those books that I feel so grateful that I ended up happening to read. It feels like it was meant to happen that way. And it talks a lot about uncovering the real why. Often as humans, we work at a kind of very surface level and we assume what's in our conscious mind, what we've kind of rationally been able to figure out is the real why that we're doing whatever we're doing. And often, I'm not going to say all the time, but often that's not the case. Often we've convinced ourselves we're doing something for some reason, but we actually don't know why, which of course is so, what we're constantly talking about in Waking the Wild, in terms of like, often it's actually shadow running the show, and it's the shadow's why that we're doing whatever we're doing. So brilliant book, absolutely recommend it, really to anyone, but I think particularly if you're in business and in business of some kind, it feels very in alignment with a lot of what we're up to in Waking the Wild. So big 5 stars from me on that one. And then over to what I've been creating in the last month. And interestingly, I was pondering what I would share with you, because I'm always creating. There's always something, you know, sorry, yeah. Dogs have alerted to something, but I'm going to try and ignore them and carry on. So there's usually a big long list of things I could choose from that I've been creating. And this time I was thinking, actually, what I feel so appreciative right now in terms of creations is what we're up to in Waking the Wild Medicine. And then funnily enough, in the pre-show party in the group just now, I said to Sarah, is there anything else that you think would be useful to mention right now? And Sarah said the same, talking about medicine would be good, and the transformations of the students, which have been amazing. So that sealed the deal. I'm going to talk to you about what we're creating in medicine right now. So if you don't already know, Waking the Wild Medicine is our 9-month-long crucible. It's the second year that we've run it. And it really is, in many ways, a jewel in our crown. It's the deepest expression of our medicine. It very much is what Jonathan and I were put on this earth to do. The serving of our medicine is guiding others to be their medicine. And so this is something that's like so dear to our heart. It really is like such a privilege, such a blessing, and sometimes a real challenge too. And we're in the penultimate month. So this is month 8. We finish next month, which really like is going to be hard. It's going to be hard for us and the circle. It feels like we've journeyed lifetimes together. But this month, we're really seeing how far they've all come since we began in March. We're in the midst of them creating what we call their sacred offer. So they've spent the way that we structure medicine is so much of the work is actually in the uncovering of their medicine, which requires going so deep into their wounds. It really isn't easy work. I was pondering this morning, actually, that whilst we are really open and honest when we're talking about medicine, when we're marketing for it, when we're rolling for it, we're really honest that it is hard. It's the toughest crucible of any that we offer. It really is an initiation, and we're really honest about that. But I was thinking, when people are feeling that call to it, I think it almost doesn't matter what we say. That's missed, because the excitement, the possibility is so amazing, so magical. I think it's really hard to convey actually how tough it will be at times. And I was thinking, I actually envy like my shamanic teacher. It's got a real symbolic thing where he can mention the fact that like at some point during the training, you're going to be buried underground for a night. And that symbolically really speaks to the level of initiation. It's by no means the only challenge, it's by no means the only initiation, but that symbolically really indicates to people, like, if you're choosing into this, you're also choosing into that experience. And so I was thinking, like, we really could do with something similar that really like emphasizes, like, this is going to be probably the toughest thing you've done in your entire life. And having journeyed through that work, now at this point, the people in medicine are getting to the point where they're very clear, like, this is what I came here to do. This is my medicine. And for some, it's, I guess, a clearer understanding of things that they already had a sense of about themselves. And then for others, it is a complete I kind of think that surprise doesn't do it justice, but it's like they had no clue about what their medicine was at the beginning of the year. But what I can say is, no matter kind of where they are in that spectrum, wow, to see them starting to create these offers that they're going to be putting out to the world to serve their medicine. Oh my gosh, it is, it's as you can hear, I'm speechless. It is just incredible. It really is. And the thing that I know already, you know, it's why we do what we do, but the thing that just never ceases to delight me and amaze me is how unique every person's medicine is. And so even though the work we do, and particularly the work we do in medicine, is very specific to magical people, and so the people who one way or another are here as like healers, shamans, priestesses, witches, because it's very specific to those people, you'd think their medicine would be quite similar, and it really is not. It really is not. And it's just incredible to see they've all gone through this same work, and at this point are getting so clear on their uniqueness, and like, wow, just incredible. There's one of the women is just this absolute radiant beam of joy and light, and she's all about bringing people's creativity alive. And then on the other end, we've got people who are all about really moving women from people pleasing to pleasure. And then we've got people who are really uncovering like the shamanic path is for them, and really going deep into relationship with their drum and to the land, and to understanding what's next for them on that path. So it's really, really varied. So I'm going to leave it there, because I probably end up show just waxing lyrical about waking the wild medicine. But all I can say is, like, if you're hearing anything in this absolutely is not me plugging medicine at all. It's as in plugging Wake Wild medicine. It's really me wanting to let you know that trust that. What I really wish is, going back 10 years ago, I was searching for this without realizing I was searching for it. I was searching for that understanding of that unique medicine that I was here to be. And I absolutely wish I could have heard someone saying the things I'm saying now. So trust that. If you're feeling some kind of resonance, know that you have got unique medicine. And whether it's aligned for you to join us in a future Waking Wild medicine, or to follow some other path, really trust the fact that you have got unique medicine, and oh my goodness, the world needs it. Okay, right, let's dive into the questions. So we have a title here. I'm going to read it just because I love it. The title is All the Everything You Always Wanted to Know About X, but were afraid to ask. And X is the thing you'd love to ask me. And of course, it's a play on the classic book, Everything, what's it? I've forgotten the Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Sex, but were afraid to ask. And I think I said there's a little bit of a story here actually between me and this book that I might mention on the show, so I'm going to. So one of the features of autism can be something called hyperlexia, where you have a kind of, I guess, advanced vocabulary, often at an early age, and then that kind of continues in later life. So a greater ability or a greater understanding, usage capacity with language than is typical. And that was me. So I was reading fluently from the age of 3, and so by the time I hit school, it was ridiculous, frankly, because it was one of those ones where I'm just like, actually, it would have been really helpful if I hadn't been taught to read already, because whilst all the other children were kind of working their way through the books in, you know, spending most of infant school, I came there and was reading like the very top books, finished those, and then, I mean, I'm sure they could have done better than this, but basically I used to sit in the corner of the class reading comics, which is fine by me, but maybe not the best use of my time, I don't know. But anyway, cut a long story short, it was very much a blessing and a curse. And one of the curses of it was that I've just described, but also the fact that any reading material, I was also just like, like an insatiable reader. So I would read anything I could get my hands on. And so any books that were for adults, I would read. And we had a bookcase with all sorts of books, and one of them was this very book. And I suspect I don't know if my parents had actually said like it's not really appropriate, or whether they just assumed I wouldn't pick it up. I don't know. But I devoured that book. This was probably when I was 5. And if you've ever read the book, it isn't tame. It isn't tame. It goes into some quite, if I remember rightly, I mean, this is obviously decades ago now. If I remember rightly, there was a whole section on women shooting ping pongs out of their vagina. So it like really wasn't just like the basics of sex. It went into some quite kind of, you know, like fetishy areas and stuff like that. So I really did know everything about sex from a very early age. Anyway, I really digress, but it felt honouring to do justice to the classic book that's made quite an impact on me in my life. So here is the first question. What is true will, and who stroke what chooses to be in or out of alignment with that will? And so I'm going to start with that. That is, again, like almost like what's the meaning of life level of question. And that's fine. I can meet it. But what I'm going to do is like break it down into the 2 parts of that question. What is true will? And then I'll answer the second part. So this is actually really, really perfect in terms of our philosophy at Waking the Wild, which shortly really isn't going to be very long at all now. We would have rebirthed, and this will be articulated very clearly on our new website. So for the moment, I'm going to have to verbally explain it. Hopefully before long, I'll be able to actually have something I can show you. But in short, I'm going to talk about it now because it will really be helpful then for me to then use that as a foundation to have this conversation from. And I will have mentioned this before, but this is the first time you've heard me. This will be really helpful, I hope. So we talk about the principles of Wake and Wild using our kind of own version of the world tree. And so we have a kind of, the world tree is, in fact, I'm not going to talk about the world tree because it's going to make it more complicated, but it's inspired by the world tree. And I want to really kind of credit the world tree, which is a very ancient tradition that was found, you know, across the world throughout history. And so really want to be clear that our tree is very much inspired by the world tree. The Waking the Wild tree, if you imagine a tree with the branches at the top, the trunk in the middle, and then the roots in the bottom, in the Waking the Wild tree, those branches are spirit. So they represent the work that we can do to ascend to spirit. So, you know, very, most forms of spirituality are about that transcendence or ascension up to spirit. So that's why it's at the top as the branches. In the middle, we have what we could call ego maturation. So the work that we are in with Waking the Wild isn't about saying, let's get rid of the ego is bad, we don't need the ego, let's try and one way or another just dissolve it or get rid of it. It's about maturing it. And this is something, again, that we see throughout so many ancient cultures. It isn't about trying to get rid of it. It's about becoming a true adult. It's about having your ego act in alignment with other aspects of your deeper self, which I'm going to get into in a moment. And so we call that ego maturation, that true adulthood, we call that sovereignty. And so that's the middle of the tree. The trunk is that sovereignty, that mature ego. The roots of the tree are representing soul and that descent into the soul, which is often accessed through the body and through our connection with the land. So this is very much that downward descent into that unique fractal of spirit that we are. And so the whole tree ultimately is one. It's one tree, of course, and it's really helpful to recognize these different parts of the tree can be at different points on our path the place to focus. And again, the work we do at Wake in the Wild spans that whole tree, which is very unusual. I'm going to say that at the outset. The reason our work is so broad and so deep is because it covers these paths that often are even just like parts of the path, actually, not even the entirety of one of those paths, is what typically a teacher might focus on. They might typically be focused mainly on, for example, the spirit aspect, or mainly the soul aspect. Because of the work we do and because of what's required, the Wake in the Wild tree spans all of those three. So I hope that's helpful as a kind of foundation. So coming back to the true will. And so those of you that aren't familiar with a kind of more like magical framework, magical tradition, true will is a very kind of magical term. It's often linked to the work of people like Aleister Crowley. And so it's, if you've been involved in anything kind of to do with like ceremonial magic, I think to an extent maybe chaos magic, that kind of magic, you likely would have come across this term true will. The way we talk about it isn't a kind of like for like definition that's used in magical circles, but it's close. And so we often will use the word true will really as a bit of a synonym for soul. And again, I'm not saying that's how it's always used in other magical circles, but it's how we use it, that we'll be talking about ultimately your soul, your unique soul, what you came here for, what is an alignment for you. We'll be talking about it in terms of, again, those roots of the tree, so the unique fractal of spirit that you came here to be. And sometimes we may well describe that as true will. So you could say it's like the will of your soul. It's also sometimes talked about as divine will. And this again is important because the soul ultimately is still part of the one. It's still part of spirit. It's still divine. It is this unique fractal of spirit though. So hopefully that answers the what is true will part. And it may have seemed like I had to kind of take you massively around the houses in order to answer the question, but it felt like the clearest way to be able to answer that question. And probably one way or another, I'll kind of keep referring back to that tree one way or another. But again, it's just a really helpful framework to hold these seemingly quite paradoxical different things in one place. So that's true will. Then the second part of the question is one of those questions that could take you down the deepest rabbit hole. It's an amazing question, and I'm going to do my best to answer it in a clear way that's sort of useful and practical. And I'm going to name, it's one of those questions that there's like so many different levels you could answer this at, and to an extent everything I say is really metaphor. It's not like literally this is how it is necessarily, but I'm going to say it in a way that I'm hoping will make sense, and again naming how we've just been talking about things from that tree. So the first part is what is true will. The second part, who or what chooses to be in or out of alignment with that will. So if we now replace the word true will with soul, for the reasons I said, so what is soul, and who or what chooses to be in and out of alignment with that soul? Can you see why this is so mind-boggling? Because it's like, okay, so if I'm the soul, who on earth would choose that? This is why that work of sovereignty is so vital. That's why we have the work that we have all together in that tree. It is that sovereign ego. It is that sovereign part of you that is able to make that choice. I'm not going to go into, there is a whole kind of separate conversation we could be in about free will. Do we really choose? Are we the thinker? Are we not the thinker? I'm not going to go there for the moment. What I'm going to say is, and this is as much as much something that looks true to me as it is just useful. You know, in some ways, I would invite you to like not worry too much about whether you think the exact ways that I'm naming this is, you know, the full truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, and recognize that this is, or could be for you, but I've certainly seen it's very useful for many people that we've worked with. It is actually a very just useful, pragmatic, powerful way to be in life and to create the life that's aligned for you. So coming back to who or what chooses, it's that sovereign part. It's that part of you that has sovereignty over your life, that can look across the landscape of your life, can have a vision, can recognize what's in alignment, can recognize, and of course this all happens with work. This isn't necessarily something we're born with. The work is to create that connection with soul. The work is to create that connection with spirit. The work is to mature the ego. But from that place, which is of course ongoing, we are able to make the sovereign choice, which is something you probably would have heard me talk about before, to be in alignment with that will, with that soul, which doesn't, of course, always come easy. You probably heard me talk before about the sovereign price versus the victim price. Often choosing to be in alignment with our soul requires paying a sovereign price. It requires taking a risk. It requires potentially upsetting people. It requires maybe not living, you know, in such a kind of comfortable, stable way. And so that choice is really only available to us once we've created that sovereignty, where we are clear enough, powerful enough, courageous enough to be able to choose to be in alignment with soul. Okay, that is the first question answered. And I'm also aware that probably every question I answer probably spawns all sorts of other questions. And if so, do let us know. Really happy to, one way or another, answer any questions that arise from this show. I'm going to take a quick sip of my drink and then move into the next question, which also really beautifully links to the first one. So this is kind of quite a nice building upon the first one. Okay, question 2. Why do some people have their desires realized and others don't? Why do some people have their desires realized and others don't? A great question. So I'm going to start off by talking about desire. And the best way, I think, to make this as, I guess, as simple as possible, as clear as possible, is talking about it from the perspective of going back to the tree again. When we're talking about desire from this level, from a kind of waking the world level, and what we're really interested in here, we're talking about soul desires. We're talking about the desires of your soul, which again could be described as true will, like what you're here for, what your soul is longing for. And there's also going to be desires that are shadow. You almost certainly would have heard me talk about shadow before, but very briefly, shadow is parts of you that have been pushed out of awareness, often through trauma or conditioning when we're younger, but there are aspects of self that have been pushed out of our awareness and still exert their influence. The challenge is we don't know they're there, therefore we don't recognize that they're exerting their influence. And one of the ways they can exert their influence is in their desires. And typically the two different ways that shadow will express its desire, let's say, is either in a desire to replay the very same trauma that created the shadow in the first place, or it desires you to do things that will protect you seemingly from experiencing the same trauma. And so I'm going to give you a quick example of this. So if, say, for example, the trauma that created a part of you to be separated and put into shadow was around being rejected, some kind of rejection wound. And so someone with that kind of wounding, which is a very common wounding, most people probably have gotten that to some extent, the shadow desire may well be to create experiences that have them be rejected, to experience rejection. Sometimes this is literally is them being rejected. Sometimes it's the perception of being rejected, but they're not really. It can come in either form. And so that's often the case. And it's the way that shadow will keep within what's known, what's safe, what really, this is going to sound awful, but like what it feels it deserves, as in, this is the life I've come here for. I've been rejected. That's normal for me. I'm going to keep replaying out that trauma. And so that would be one way that a shadow desire would play out. The other end is, I can't possibly allow myself to be rejected again because it's so painful. Therefore, my desire is to create, let's say again, use an example of being rejected. I'm going to create a life where I live in a very sort of small, safe, certain way so that I protect myself from rejection. Typically, shadow gets its way. So if we've got shadow desires playing out, until we do the work to illuminate it and alchemize it, shadow desires will be realized. And we can know that by looking at our lives and seeing the things that we say that we don't want. It's going to be because the shadow part, whatever's in shadow, did want it, did desire it. So just recognize that first. It's really easy for us to think like, oh, you know, why does that person seem to have everything we want, where here I am, I can't seem to fulfill my desires. Just recognize that your life is your desires realized. Just the ones that you're not seeing or you don't want are going to be your shadow desires. When it comes to your soul desires, again, and I would have spoken about this at length in many different ways before, but you know, so much of the work that we're about is doing what's required to make contact with soul, to start to be able to hear what our soul is saying to us, is telling us, is for us. And then noticing what we need to do to bring those other parts of us back into the whole. So that's really like shadow work 101, is to notice what's in shadow and do the work to welcome it back, love it back into the whole. As we're doing that, this is where we need to again come back to sovereignty, because without the sovereignty, we can recognize, okay, now I'm listening. I can hear what soul's saying, is telling me that I need to do X in order to move deeper onto my soul path. Often the thing our soul desires isn't typically something that's like easy. If it was, we probably would have already done it. Typically, and again, of course, not all soul desires are this, but I'd say in the main, the ones that aren't being realized, going back to the question, typically because they're quite big and scary. And so this again is, there's the first of all, the understanding that we need to be able to know what is a soul desire versus something that's coming from a shadow, and then have the sovereignty to act on it, to take aligned action to realize it. So if so the people who have their desires realized, seemingly, we can never really know for sure from the outside looking in, but seemingly the people who do have their desires realized is because firstly, they've made contact with their deep soul desires. Secondly, they've got the sovereignty to take the aligned action to do what's required to have it realized. I'm just thinking if I've got an example. Actually, I'll use the same example that came up in the medicine circle this morning, which is a great example, because often our soul desires, again, aren't necessarily the things that we would have thought we'd have chosen. But when I had the call to shamanism, however many years ago that was now, that is a pure soul desire. My shadow really would not have desired that, and quite frankly, like, my human wouldn't have done. This is a pure soul desire, and I needed to do the work I'd done to even be able to hear that, because it was so unwelcome. And then it's kind of like hearing it, oh, and then it really took sovereignty to choose it. And that, again, if I hadn't had the degree of sovereignty I had at the time, I wouldn't have chosen it. I would have, one way or another, kept putting it off, dismissing it, saying, why on earth do I need to do that? I'm already perfectly happy doing what I'm doing in life. The work I'm doing, I'm perfectly fulfilled by. I've got no reason or desire to now train in shamanism. And yet it was a soul desire, and I had the sovereignty to choose it, even though it was something that one way or another was going to cost me, not least being buried underground. So that's an example. And so again, these things can sound, you know, as I'm explaining them, I'm obviously doing my best to speak about them in a very kind of clear way, which can make it sound as though these things are easy, or these things are, you know, very binary. Of course, you know, when it's ourselves, when it's us that's feeling all of these things, this shame and this pain, of course, it's not necessarily going to be as easy as I'm describing it. And, you know, that's why ultimately we're here to be able to keep moving through these things, keep growing, keep recognizing what we're being called to. And I'd really, again, because this question mentions, like, why do some people, of course, this is bringing up that sense of comparison, this sense of other people have their desires realized and yet I don't. And this really can be the thing that stops us when we think we're in some kind of competition with others. We're not, we can't be. Our soul desires are unique to us. There is nothing we can compare to out there that makes any sense whatsoever. The only thing to do is to focus on who we are, who we've come here to be, and what's next for us to be able to choose it. Okay, I'm going to take another sip of my drink. How am I doing for time? This is a flying by, actually. I'm going to need to see if I can manage to get through. I've got two more questions. One of them I think is quite short. I think one of them I can actually, because of the work we've already done so far, I think I can check that one off quite fast, and then I'll do what I can to yeah, the last one again is definitely a show in its own right, but I'll do what I can. So next question: what's at play for someone repeating the same pattern over and over and over again that doesn't look to be in service to them or anyone else? So I'll read that again. What's at play for someone repeating the same pattern over and over and over again that doesn't look to be in service to them or anyone else? So this is, because of what we've already just traveled through, is quite simple to name. This will be, as I spoke about earlier, that the way that shadow has its own desires, and this will be that latter kind of shadow desire, perhaps. I mean, actually, it could be either one, but basically it's that shadow desire of, like, let's stay in what's known. Let's stay in what feels safe to me, even though it could actually be, it could really be anything but. It could be so harmful. It could be so stressful. It could be so painful. And yet, if shadow is getting the vote, if shadow's got hold of the reins there, that will be what keeps playing out. It'll keep playing out into one way or another. That shadow is alchemized into the system, and the sovereignty is strong enough to be able to choose what is really aligned. So hopefully, let me just see if there's anything else I can say on that. I think the only thing I would say, actually, in addition to that, is The beauty is when we clearly do have the same pattern playing out over and over again, because that's not always the case. It's not always the case that we can see it. It almost always is the case that we have the same patterns playing out, but sometimes they come in such disguises, we don't recognize it. And so just to even know, like, wow, this is so clear that it's the same pattern, that in itself gives us power. That in itself allows us to have that gnosis of, okay, this clearly is shadow. This clearly isn't something that's from soul. And to really recognize, like, if that's the same pattern that's showing up over and over and over again, like, direct absolutely everything required to integrate that. Because until that's done, it will play out over and over again. Okay, last question. And another goodie. Why might we have resistance to ritual and ceremony? And what real difference does ritual and ceremony make in our lives and to living more fully and actualizing our gifts? So I'm going to read that again. Why might we have resistance to ritual and ceremony? And what real difference does ritual and ceremony make in our lives and to living more fully and actualizing our gifts? So first of all, even though it's probably in some ways obvious, I'm just going to quickly define what's meant by ritual and ceremony, which will make it then easier as I'm explaining the rest of the answer to this. So ritual typically is seen as like something that we do repeatedly. So dictionary definitions will mention things like a repeated set of actions. So typically a ritual is something we might do with quite a lot of frequency. So like daily or weekly. It's something that we repeat, you know, could be quite short, could be like a 5-minute thing that we do every morning. So that typically is what's meant by ritual. A ceremony typically is bigger and less frequent. Again, I'm saying typically in both because they can be used interchangeably. And even when I was looking at the dictionary definition of ceremony, it mentioned a ritual with religious or cultural significance, which doesn't make complete sense because often rituals have religious or cultural significance. But the key thing is, it then says an official gathering to celebrate, commemorate, or otherwise mark some event. So a helpful way to look at ceremony is, you know, celebrating Christmas is a ceremony. It's a kind of once a year ceremony. And so again, typically a ceremony will be something often involving more than one person. It doesn't have to be, but often will. May not be as frequent as a ritual and often has this kind of like a big significance where we're really marking some event or commemorating some event. So the important thing to recognize is ritual and ceremony have been around for, you know, as long as we've been able to record what humans have done. It is an intensely human thing to do. In some ways, you could say to be human is to invoke ritual and ceremony. Of course, in this modern world, it appears that to a large extent, we're no longer involved in ritual and ceremony, but that's an illusion. It is so human to be in ritual and ceremony. We still are. It's just largely unconscious. And so just to recognize that in itself is really helpful. It's unlikely to be actually new to anyone to be in ritual and ceremony. The difference is when we're saying resistance to ritual and ceremony, it's really about conscious, aligned ritual and ceremony. That's where the resistance will come. But to even recognize, well, actually, I'm already in ritual and ceremony. It's just the fact that it's not conscious to me. I don't even realize I've chosen it, that it can seem as though it's a big leap to making conscious ritual and ceremony. So to answer that first part of the question, why might we have resistance to ritual and ceremony? I think a lot of it is the fact it feels this kind of like unknown, big, scary thing and a bit weird, a bit kind of like, I'm a fraud. It's only for people who are, I don't know, more magical or spiritual and have been trained in this, and just not recognizing like this is human. This is our human birthright. It's in our DNA. It's in our blood and bones. If you're listening to this, I can pretty much guarantee you are in some form of ritual and ceremony on a very regular basis. So I really want you to hear that. You're already doing it. You're doing it beautifully. The invitation is actually to now make it conscious. So that's the first part of the question. And I'm going to give us some examples of like very typical unconscious rituals we might be in. Brushing our teeth is one. And interesting, that came up in the book that I mentioned earlier about alchemy. And he was talking again about this, asking the deeper why. And it was talking about the question of why do people brush their teeth? And most people will go to kind of things like, well, it, reduces plaque and bacteria and stops you getting cavities. But when you actually look at the behavior of when people brush their teeth, it doesn't really align that rationally with that reason to do it. As he says in the book, if that's why people brushing their teeth, people would brush their teeth after every meal, not just morning and evening. And the fact is, most people don't brush their teeth after every meal. And he's saying the real why can be, again, looked at when we look at why people brush their teeth. Part of it is just that kind of conditioning, like, oh, I'm just going to do that because it's what we do. But it's also, when you look at the times when we break outside of that routine, when we might be, for example, going on a hot date, most people will brush their teeth. So a lot of it's done for much more kind of like what looks good, smells look like, the aesthetics of what gets created by brushing our teeth. So recognize often when we do these rituals, we're unconscious to even doing the ritual, but we may well be unconscious to why we're doing the ritual too. We may think we know why we do it, but we actually don't. Another one is checking our phone. That ritual of God knows how many times a day, and like a really unconscious reflex, like look at my phone, look at my phone. That's another ritual that, most people are in on a God knows how many times a day basis. So the difference, so going to that second part of the question, what real difference does ritual and ceremony make in our lives? The question really is, what real difference does, sorry, the dogs are knocking at the door. I'm going to see if I can get a family member to help. The question really ought to be, what real difference does conscious ritual and ceremony, or aligned, ritual and ceremony that's chosen and consciously chosen to align with soul? Thank you. And the difference is, this is, I'm going to take a moment because this is huge. This really, there is so much of our will, our soul that can be created in ritual and ceremony. It's hard for me to overstate this. When we are intentionally embarking on ritual and ceremony that again is in aligned for our soul, we are embodying what we came here for. It can seem as though what we're doing in a ritual is just kind of going through some motions, but what we're actually doing, again, assuming it is a very conscious aligned ritual, what we're actually doing is embodying in the movement of the very thing that we're here to do. And so the last, I think it's the last All the Everything, no, it was the one before that I did with Sarah about the feminine. I spoke there about some of the rituals that I do every morning. Those rituals I do every morning are me deeply embodying the feminine, a very conscious act of invocation. It isn't just a mindless ritual. It isn't just a kind of set of things I'm doing. It's me acting out my will in that ritual, which then goes on to impact the rest of my day. That ritual is literally an embodiment of my soul, an embodiment of my will. And I'm going to talk briefly to archetypes here. I was actually pondering, I don't know why it came into my awareness, but I was pondering archetypes this morning. As you know, it's something that I'm obsessed by, is, absolutely huge in the work we do at Waking the Wild. And I was thinking about how, I don't know how many years ago it was before I really understood what archetypes truly were and how important they'd become to my path. So I don't know how many years ago about it, maybe 6 years ago. I was doing a course, a year-long course with someone, and part of it was around archetypes. And it left me, that aspect of the course left me cold. Like at the time, I would have been so shocked if you were to say, I would go on to have the relationship with archetypes that I have now. Like I would have been like what? This, like the whole archetype bit, it just feels like absolute nonsense to me. Like that's where I was. Like I literally thought it was a waste of time. Like, just like fantastical nonsense, but like the worst kind of fantastical nonsense, like not even that interesting, just a complete waste of time. That's how I was seeing it. I don't honestly know whether that was the way that teacher was teaching them, whether perhaps she hadn't really embodied those archetypes that she was teaching. It may be that it wasn't down to her at all. It was just where I was and the fact I wasn't yet open to them. I honestly don't know. But all I can say is at the time, for whatever reason, and potentially partly the way they were taught, but again, I'm not making this about that teacher or anything like that. But my sense is the way that they were taught, or certainly what I was open to taking in, wasn't allowing me to connect with the archetypes in the way that I now understand is not just possible, but is like one of the most powerful things I've experienced in my entire life. So how this links to ritual and ceremony is, without ritual and ceremony, we aren't really going to be able to move past a like very theoretical understanding of archetypes. Archetypes are brought alive, are embodied through ritual and ceremony. One way or another, I would say, actually, if you were to take ritual and ceremony, like, across the world, I would say a large number of them, one way or another, are about the embodiment of archetypes, or what we could say is spirits. The two things come together so powerfully, so naturally. And so, again, given so much of our work is about archetypes, recognizing that this is, if you've got any understanding of the power of archetypes to just expand you, to bring you into the fullness of who you are, you will really want to adopt ceremony and rituals. This is literally how they can change your life. Because if you are on a daily basis, and I'm just going to give the simplest example of this, if you're on a daily basis, have a ritual to invoke the archetype that you're here to embody, here to be inspired by, to be activated by. Every single morning, you are in a ritual that does that. That is your life. That is how it changes your life. What you are embodying, what you are activating, what you are calling into being in that ritual is your life. So, as you can hear, I'm passionate about this. But for me, and again, I came from a background, a kind of form of spiritual teaching, which was almost like not just devoid of ritual and ceremony, but kind of like, I'd say fairly dismissive at best of ceremony and ritual. So if you've come from, say, for example, a form of spiritual teaching, or just maybe like it's just not even been in your awareness as something to do, I really get it. It can seem as though it's just like unnecessary, like pomp and performance. Why do we need that if we can kind of just go directly connect with spirit? If I can know myself as, whatever way we might want to name it, if I can know myself as one, why would I want to, go through these like silly sort of play acting? And again, if you are here to embody your soul, if you're here to align with your soul, you will greatly benefit from consciously choosing ritual and ceremonies to honor that, to support that. Okay, I think I'm done. And thank you so much for your questions. There's been this has been really fun for me, so I think we might do this more often, this kind of show. So again, thank you so much. If you did ask a question, if you've got questions that you didn't ask before this show but have now either arisen just because you've realized like, oh, I've got the opportunity to ask something, or perhaps it was invoked by whatever I've talked about here, do let us know. And when we next do a show like this, I'll be very happy to include them, or it might be that we make a whole show specifically on that topic. Okay, now what do I need to let you know? Oh, one other final thing on the topic of what I was just talking about in terms of ritual and ceremony. We very recently released an episode with my teacher, Jez Hughes, on the topic of making offerings, which of course is a form of ritual. Can't recommend that enough. It really is one of those like kind of cornerstone episodes that I think we'll be referring back to for years to come. So if you haven't listened to that already and you started to hear something in the idea of ritual and ceremonies that was tickling your fancy, go listen to that one next. Okay. So if you are, I always find this confusing. If you are watching this in the Facebook group, either live or on the replay, and you aren't yet a subscriber to our free podcast, you might be interested in going to do that. And that's at primalhappiness.co/podcast. If you are listening to it on the podcast and you're not a member of our group and you haven't joined me before in the pre-show party or the live making of this, you might want to go join the group, and that's at facebook.com/group/primalhappiness. If you are I'm now confusing myself. I think I need to mention our YouTube channel, but my mind's gone like confused as to where you might be. So I'm just going to give you the link of our YouTube channel, which is, I believe, youtube.com/wakeninthewild is the one thing that we've actually got around to branding in our new brand, which is coming soon, I promise. And also, if you're not subscribed to our Moonly News, which is our newsletter that we send out every full moon and new moon, which is jam-packed with resources. You actually get a ritual there from our Sarah. So again, if you fancy trying a ritual, there's your next breadcrumb. And that's at primalhappiness.co/moonly. And if you're interested in going deeper on the path of waking the wild, if you've heard something here that makes you think, I would like their support to go deeper onto this path of soul, go check out what we've got at primalhappiness.co/go deeper. What I can tell you is the next cruise we'll be opening will be Waking the Wild Sovereign in January. That's at primalhappiness.co/sovereign. We aren't yet open for application. There'll be very limited spaces, and we've already got people wanting to apply. And so if you are thinking that could be for you, go register your interest, because the spaces will go fast, and that's at primalhappiness.co/WTWS. I'm going to give you also the link for medicine, just because I waxed lyrical about it earlier. If you're interested in the next Waking Wild medicine, which will be starting early-ish next year, we haven't agreed a date yet, but early 2023, that will be at primalhappiness.co/medicine. I think I'm done. Thank you so much for joining me. I so appreciate it. I really do. And I'll be back again next week with, I can't remember what episode it is, but I'll be back again next week. Thank you so much. I love you. Mwah. Have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.